Aphorisms. Take this aphorism by Nietzsche. Quote, "The existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon." End quote. From The Birth of Tragedy. So let's take it again, a bit slowly this time. The existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. Aesthetic phenomenon, two Greek words which are naturalized in English as well, used by Nietzsche here. Aesthetics to do with art, with the sense of feeling, and phenomenon, the sense of appearance, something appearing, the phenomenal world, relating ironically in this case to Kantian philosophy. Not the thing in itself, the noumenon, but the phenomenon, mere appearance. So life is, or existence, as he says here, is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon, only as art appearance. The existence of the world, the existence, the word used here in German is Dasein, which we know from reading Heidegger. Usually in Heidegger it's translated as being, but with a capital B. And we know that Heidegger concentrates his philosophy on an exploration of this very thing. But here with Nietzsche we translate it as existence, which has the Latinate form, which has the sense of standing out, something which exists, stands out to our attention, so to speak. So the existence of the world is justified, and the German word here is based on right, i.e. what is right and righteous and correct, rightly. So life is rightly considered as an artistic phenomenon, as an artistic appearance. This aphorism occurs about 4 times in The Birth of Tragedy, which was Nietzsche's first book, written in 1871 when he was about 27. And he refers again to this aphorism when he adds a new preface to The Birth of Tragedy 15 years later in 1886. The preface is called An Attempt at Self-Criticism. And in that year, 1886, he made prefaces to many of his previous works as a kind of recap and re-evaluating of his own work. And he picks up on this aphorism in section 5 of the Attempt at Self-Criticism, noting that it occurs throughout The Birth of Tragedy and more or less sums up The Birth of Tragedy. He calls the statement a piquant proposition. So it is very much a self-conscious aphorism. Again, quote, "The existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon," end quote. It's the first aphorism in this nice little book, The Sayings of Friedrich Nietzsche on Duckworth. Worth trying to track down a copy of this. It's using the Oscar Levy translation, which is our tough Nietzschean edition in English. It's the one we go to. It's the best translation still. The interesting thing about this, let's imagine that this is the only book of Nietzsche's that survived. Let's imagine that there was a Holocaust of some kind, and all of Nietzsche's published works and his notebooks and everything were all destroyed, except for this one little collection made, selecting his aphorisms, quoting out from his books, a line here, a line there. Imagine if that was the only thing that survived. Well, when we look at the pre-Socratics, often that is all we have of their work. Heraclitus, for example, Nietzsche's favourite philosopher. We don't have his full works. They were all destroyed. But we do have the quotes from his works, lines written down, often by his enemies, which appeared in other people's works, obviously, such as Plato and Aristotle and others. So we only have Heraclitus through his aphorisms. And that is a lesson that was learnt very hard by Nietzsche. If that happens to any writer, then they will be remembered only by their sayings. It could happen a number of ways. The books could just drop out of currency, could become rare. But the aphorisms will stay on the lips of men around the world who will say the existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomena. Who said that, I wonder? Well, it was Nietzsche. But as taken as an aphorism on its own, if it goes out into the world with its boots on but without any context, then the aphorism can be given the most widest of interpretations, as aphorisms obviously can be. And this aphorism sounds quite like aestheticism, doesn't it? It sounds a bit like art for art's sake, the late 19th century decadent deliquescence of culture, where everything becomes what we now call arty-farty, perhaps. And that doesn't align with Nietzsche. Nietzsche is very hard. So we only get the hardness of this aphorism if we look at it in context. And so we see it appears in probably Nietzsche's softest of books, the first book, The Birth of Tragedy, where he still is toying with metaphysics and Schopenhauer and Wagner. It occurs about 4 times in various formulations within the book, Birth of Tragedy, 1871. And then in that preface, as I've mentioned, the attempt at self-criticism, in the 5th section of that, he looks closely at this as an aphorism and calls it that piquant proposition, as I've said. And he addresses it in this way. This aphorism was formulated, like many sayings and thoughts, in opposition to a prevailing trend of thought. And that thought, prevailing trend of thought, was that life is justified as a moral entity. That was the prevailing assumption, the Christianized assumption that morality was the be-all and end-all of life. And going back to our previous views on altruism, still persists today that a life which is lived altruistically for others, at one's own expense and to the benefit of others or other people or animals or the environment, that kind of life is justified. Only that kind of life. Squander your life on wine, women, and song, well, you've lived nothing. You've done nothing. You've just thrown your life away. But live your life and leave all your belongings and wealth to a charity, an animal charity or an environmental charity, and you've justified. You've given yourself, your life, meaning. And so life, in that view, is justified as a morality, a moral phenomenon, you might say. Or rather, they would avoid the word phenomenon, as a moral reality, as a moral duty. Life is justified only as a moral duty. That is the prevailing assumption, the sackcloth and ashes assumption, which is weighing down heavily on everybody in the 19th century. And Nietzsche's there, and he tells us in his very first book, when he's still a young professor, no, life is justified by art. But he's not saying it as a young decadent. He's actually saying that life itself is art. He's not saying that we make art for art's sake. He's actually saying that art is life and life is art, and that art is phenomena, it is appearance. Therefore, life itself is appearance, illusion, as much as a painting is an illusion, as much as a sculpture is an illusion. Art, life are illusory, essentially. And therefore, the only justification of life is art. And he takes this further in the preface, using it as a kind of parable almost, saying that God, the artist God is an artist. The artist God, not the moral God, not the jealous God, the artist God. He creates worlds, he destroys worlds willy-nilly, almost a pagan view here. God is a great artist who creates and destroys, and redeems himself by thus doing. In other words, this God, if he sat around doing nothing and creating nothing, would be nothing. So in order to justify himself, make himself right, make himself righteous, he creates worlds and destroys worlds willy-nilly, because every artist has to destroy as much as they create, in fact. And that we, life, living things, are the creations of that God, that artist God. And we, if we are artists and creators, we are merely vessels and mediums through which this art flows, which ultimately all comes from the God artist, the creator artist. And this ultimately leads him to suggest that morality itself is merely a creation. And here we get to the further stamp in Zarathustra further on, where values are created or are seen as being created, although of course they flow through from the creativity and illusory nature of life. Life is all creativity, illusory, and non-permanence. And here we have the value of truth brought back in, as we saw with our talk on women. Truth is like a woman, in other words, painting up, makeup, finery, all show, illusory surface, no real depth. And Nietzsche then touches upon this is actually a pessimistic view, that life does not really have the kind of substance we all hope for. It is rather illusory. And the Creator God affirms his existence through that cosmic artwork, and therefore affirms life as a work of art.